When I walked the neighborhood in the autumn, I often passed under a mighty oak and through an ankle-deep blanket of acorns. All that neglected plant protein leads me to ask, why not nuts?
Welcome to the award-winning Food Chain Radio Show with your host, Michael Olson. And now get ready for 1 hour of What's Eating What Radio.
Hello out there. You are tuned into the 1099th edition of the Food Chain Radio podcast. Or hey, perhaps you're among our friends over there in Quebec City who are tuned in as we stream along on the Food Chain page at metrofarm.com. Well, whoever you are and wherever you are, welcome aboard. I am Michael Olson, your host for this hour of What's Eating What. Folks, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to visit with Joel and Teresa Salatin at their polyface farm in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. While showing me about the many interesting features of polyface, Joel said, "Would you like to see the pigovators in action?" Well, who could pass up an opportunity to see pigovators in action? Certainly not me. Joel drove us up to the top of his farm and into a forest. We stepped out of the truck and followed a trail into the woods, where we quickly began hearing the snorts and grunts of pigovators in action. There they were, a dozen or so of them, mighty beasts confined by an electric tape, doing what pigs do best, tearing up the ground in search of anything edible. These pigovators. This land was once a rich savanna, and it provided ample fodder for grazing animals, both wild and domestic. During the Civil War, and afterwards, the grazing animals disappeared. Then the shrubs and pines took over, and the forest became unusable. These pigovators, Joel said, are turning the forest back into savanna. What happened to polyface so many years ago happened to so much of America. When the grazers were taken off the grass, the land became covered in weeds, brush, shrubs, and trees. We see the consequence of this loss of savanna in the raging fires of the West. This leads us to ask, if we can reclaim savannas, can we also build a food chain on nuts? Well, who better to ask than Elspeth Hay, who is the author of the brand new book, Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. Welcome to the Food Chain.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your brand new book, Feed Us with Trees. How did the book signing go, the opening?
It was great. I had a launch party and a lot of fun.
Good. Well, take us back, Elspeth, to that moment when the apple fell on your head and you jumped up and you said, nuts!
Well, in fact, it was an acorn, not an apple, but I live in an oak forest that's protected as part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. And a friend sent me a TEDx talk by a woman named Marcy Mayer, who lives in Greece on a remote Aegean island. And she said that acorns are edible, which I had never heard before. And she also said that they're a superfood and one of our oldest human foods. And I sat there looking outside my window and was completely shocked to hear all of that. And so I started learning a little more about acorns as a food source and learned that actually all over the Northern Hemisphere in a huge variety of cultures, acorns have been a staple food, an everyday food like corn or wheat or rice for thousands of years.
And so you pursued that thought and pursued it and pursued it and pursued it and came out with the book.
Yeah, I kind of couldn't let it go. I didn't expect it to be such a life-altering moment when it happened, but it was one of those things where when I first learned we can eat acorns, I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then the more I learned, the more interesting it got. It turned out there was all this cultural history and social history and economic history and environmental history that was all intertwined in these really surprising ways. And so I just went really, really deep down the tree nut human relationship rabbit hole.
Well, and to show the folks just how deep you went, let's start with savannas. And because that's where we all came from, right? Or at least that's what we're
Yeah,
told.
so yeah, savanna is believed to be, the earliest human habitat, the habitat that we evolved in, and it's basically a grassy area dotted with trees. So big open grown trees with grassland underneath. And I had no idea that in North America, we actually used to have a really extensive oak savanna ecosystem that covered a lot of the Midwestern area that today we know as kind of, the breadbasket of America, where we're growing food in these really rich soils. But it turns out that those soils were created under an indigenous food production regime that was centered on these oak savanna ecosystems and managed with fire. So this fertility was built up over hundreds, thousands of years with this oak savanna and fire regimen. And now for the past 150, 200 years, we have been mining that fertility, plowing the land every year, causing a lot of runoff. And as I'm sure most listeners know, a lot of wreaking environmental havoc, basically, with our row crop system. And so I was really fascinated to learn that, in fact, there was a completely different way of producing food that pre-existed colonial settlement and made a lot more sense.
And you made the case that this might be the basis for a new food chain for agriculture. That is your book, right? That is your challenge to the world.
I think that there's a lot of potential. I grew up with two birdwatcher parents, so I spent a lot of time as a kid out in the woods learning about the habitats of different birds, and I always thought it was weird that every other species was like perfectly adapted to the place where it lived, and then we didn't seem to get anything we needed from our ecosystem. We had to go to the grocery store, we needed these industrial farms, and we were always destroying the wild places to meet our needs. And so right around the time that I learned that we can eat acorns, my mom had gotten interested in this entomologist, so someone who studies insects, named Doug Tallamy. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a really interesting guy. And he has done all these studies about plants and which plants support the most insects as sort of a proxy for what plants support the most life in an ecosystem. And it turns out that in most of the places where they exist, oaks are the top life support plant. So they're these incredibly outsized importance ecologically. And I learned that around the same time as I learned we can eat acorns. And I thought, well, that's cool. But, we had to become farmers, right? We can't be hunter-gatherers anymore. We can't rely on these wild foods because they just don't produce enough. And but I was curious enough that I researched a bit. And it turns out that is really just a story that we've written. It has no basis in actual food yield, actual food production. We have this mythology that our farm system is feeding the world, but in fact, we eat almost none of the corn and soybeans that we produce on these vast expanses of land. And in addition to that, we require huge amounts of input to fuel these systems that we have right now. So yield has to be a ratio, right? It's what you get out for what you put in. And when we look at it that way, these nut trees, not just oaks with acorns, but also chestnuts, hazelnuts, some other species, depending on where you live, are actually quite competitive and outcompete our current monocultural systems in terms of output per acre of land, and also produce, I would argue, tastier and more exciting food.
And so you formulated the idea that we could do this as agriculture. So agriculture is not just what we're doing right now, but in fact it has been practiced for millenniums by people all the time. And it's a different form of agriculture than we tend to think, but maybe we should open our minds and think a little differently.
Yeah, I think we tend to draw a really strict line between agriculture and hunting and gathering. And I think that when we look at the history, that's again sort of a fictional thing that we've made up. If you look at, so I got to know a man named Ron Reed, who's a member of the Kuruk tribe in present-day Northern California. And his people have eaten acorns since time immemorial. It's a huge food in Kuruk culture. And he started telling me about how Kuruk people tend these oak groves that produce acorns. And he was describing the way they do it, which involves a lot of prescribed fire and cultural burns. And he was telling me all the things that fire does. And it was like, okay, fire gets the ground ready for acorns to sprout. So it's preparing the seed bed. Fire controls the water cycle in the Klamath River Basin so that it doesn't get too overgrown and then become more prone to wildfire because it's so dry. Fire was controlling pests. So this acorn weevil that can affect the nuts, the smoke actually helps control those pests. Fire was recycling detritus that's on the ground and acting as a fertilizer. And the more we talked, the more I realized he's just describing farming a different species. It's not like hunting and gathering and farming are these two completely different activities. That's a story that, dominant Euro-American culture has made up to make people feel like there's a difference for a lot of really insidious cultural reasons. But in fact, it's all the same jobs. And I think that when we step back and look at that, there's a lot of people now experimenting with these tree crops in agricultural systems that are, a little more traditional to the Euro-American mind, not necessarily with fire. People are planting them and tending them in the ways that Euro-American culture knows. But in fact, there's so much overlap. And when we start looking at the world that way, suddenly you see opportunities for food production everywhere. And it's really exciting.
I wrote a book about farming small parcels of land in the city, for the city, saying, well, you can make a substantial living if you do this right. And of course, conventional agriculture said, you can't do that. Now, I suspect conventional agriculture is going to look at you and say, Elspeth, you're nuts.
Probably. I'm not too afraid of that, though. I can be nuts. That's okay.
Good for you and good for me. It's okay to be nuts. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Elspeth Hay, the author of a brand new book. And it's so exciting. The Feed Us with Trees. What a concept. Nuts and the future of food. So Elspeth today is going to present a whole new way of looking at agriculture, a whole new possibility for us. And so we'll all give her a good listen and see if she is nuts, or if nuts is what we should all be. And that's a fun proposition, because as I said earlier, as I opened the show, as I go for my walks through the neighborhood in the autumn, and there are oak trees up the street from us, and I walk underneath them, and it's just a blanket of acorns laying there, doing nothing, maybe feeding an occasional squirrel or whatnot. And the cars drive over the nuts, and it's a regular food chain there. But can nuts and trees and opening up the land to savannas again provide a whole new way for us to enjoy a new form of agriculture? That's the subject right today with Elspeth Hay, who is the author of Feed Us with Trees, Nuts, and the Future of Food. So stay tuned. We will be right back after these messages.
Hi, folks. Warren Knox here of Knox Roofing. I thought I'd share a few statistics with you. Do you know how long a frog can hold its breath? 4 minutes. Do you know how many nails the average roof requires? 7,000. What's the percentage of roofing companies that will be out of business after they've installed a roof? 80%. Here at Knox Roofing, we're still going strong, exceeding 15,000 homes now. Give us a call here at Knox Roofing at 461-0634. Thanks, folks.
Attention content producers. You can have access to a complete digital media production facility at Satellite Co-working and Digital Media Studio on Soquel Avenue. Easily rent video and audio equipment, a studio with green screen, editing suite, and audio booth, all at can't say no rates. Schedule a tour to see for yourself at satellitecoworking.com. Mention Santa Cruz Voice for 20% off your first reservation.
I've got a question for you. Do you want a lower car payment just by making a phone call? You know, most people buy a car and they pay whatever the car dealer says their interest rate is, and they forget about it and make payments. But did you know there is a secret in your contract that allows another company to refinance any car payment to try and lower it? It's true. There is indeed a company out there that knows the ins and, more importantly, the outs on car loans, and they know how to lower your current car payments. It's easy and fast, and you could have a lower car payment next month. Make this free call right now and find out if you could lower your existing car payment. Call the Car Savings Hotline right now. The call is free.
Call now, 800-471-4435, 800-471-4435, 800-471-4435. That's 800-471-4435.
When you need help escaping from an abusive relationship, call on the Angel.
Hello, I am Attorney Angel Hess, and I am ready to help you. Whether you or a loved one needs legal protection from an abusive spouse, cohabitant, or neighbor, I will help you. I have over 7 years' experience working as a lawyer protecting others from abusive relationships.
Stop the abuse now. Call on the Angel, Attorney Angel L. Hess at santacruzlegal.net.
Cannabis is one of nature's most beneficial plants. Hello, I'm Jenna. Treehouse Dispensary, we use information about cannabis to build community. Listen to Carly.
For those who would like a cannabis flower that stimulates your creativity and makes you feel happy, Treehouse suggests the sativa varietal Banjo from the local growers at Coastal Sun.
For answers to your cannabis questions, ask your friends at Treehouse Dispensary, 3651 Soquel Drive in Soquel, or ourtreehouse.io.
Let's go back for more of What's Eating What on the Food Chain with Michael Olson.
Welcome back. This is the Food Chain Radio program. Michael Olson with Elspeth Hay, the author of Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. What happened, Elspeth, to the great savannas of the American Midwest, and actually the West as well?
Yeah, it's a really long and sad story that involves a lot of violence on the part of Euro-American settlers toward the indigenous people of those places.
And trees too,
and
right?
as Euro-American... Sorry?
And trees too.
And trees too, yeah. It's interesting because a lot of Euro-American settlers who came here from Europe as immigrants actually came from places where trees were a really important part of agricultural systems. But what happened when westward expansion started is that the government was taking indigenous land and offering it to settlers, but you had to farm it. And the definition of farming was row crop farming. It did not involve trees. It did not involve tree agriculture. And starting in the early 1900s, the government also started pursuing a policy of fire suppression. So not only on this land could anyone who had it, and also a lot of indigenous land that was originally promised to indigenous nations as reservations went through this allotment process where the government said, actually, you can't have a reservation where you own land communally. You have to own private property. And so we're going to divide it up. And then if you're not farming it, we're going to take it away from you. So it really was a program of forced farming. And it took place all over the present day United States. And I think also in different ways in Canada, but I don't know as much about the history in Canada. And so if you didn't farm land, you basically weren't allowed to own it under this program. And the definition of farming was quite narrow. And so allotment agents were sent out all over the country to quote unquote teach indigenous people to farm, which if you think about the fact that the first English settlers here learned how to grow corn and beans and squash from Wampanoag people, it's pretty ironic that anyone would be pretending to teach Indigenous people how to farm. But that is what our government did. And people who didn't comply faced a lot of violence. So I think that a lot of us have it's not just like, oh, we've forgotten these foods. Knowing about these foods and trying to stay in relationship with them and tend these savanna ecosystems became quite dangerous. It was not a safe activity. And that was also true in Europe to a certain extent because, before European immigrants came here, there was this internal colonization of England and the broader area of Western Europe that involved separating land from people and people from land. And then that was just sort of this pattern of trauma that got passed on in North America. And there's a lot of history there that we don't talk about, really. I think a lot of it's been swept under the rug. We talk about European settlers coming here because it was a land of opportunity. But in fact, a lot of people came here because they had lost access to their traditional home places and ways of producing food. And none of that was what I was expecting to find when I got interested in acorns and oak savannas. But it's hard to talk about the food history without really understanding the cultural and social history.
It's what makes food history so interesting also.
True.
You make mention of the tragedy of the commons, and you speak of the Indians as being commoning, and the same was true in England. What was the tragedy of the commons?
Yeah, so I studied environmental science in college, and I was taught that the tragedy of the commons is that anytime people own land collectively, they'll always be trying to maximize their personal profit or benefit. So if you have a common field, there's the famous paper by Garrett Hardin where there's all the cattle on the field and then there's too many and they overgraze the grass, and that's the supposed tragedy of the commons. But if we look at history, the true tragedy of the commons is that almost all traditional societies in almost all places all over the world have traditionally held some property in common, collectively managed by the community. And it wasn't a free-for-all. It wasn't the type of thing where anyone can go out and harvest as much as they want or put as many cattle out as they want. People had rights to certain resources. So I was really interested to learn when I started looking at my own ancestry that in England, there was a specific common right known as rights of pannage, and that was based on the nut harvest. So, England has lots of chestnuts, hazelnuts, oak trees, and in the fall, rights of pannage allowed you to turn your animals out during the time when the nuts were falling and fatten them up for the winter before you slaughtered them for meat. And people also had rights to collect and sell nuts and also consume them. And there were, there's a huge variety of indigenous cultures all over North America and as many different traditions as there are groups of people and cultures. But what I found that there was overlap was that often these tree systems were managed communally with very specific ways of taking care of them and very specific harvest practices. And that was something that really started to change as colonial rule and expansion started to spread from England into Europe and over to North America.
So it worked for a time, and then something happened to change that. And why are we not practicing commons here? And why didn't the indigenous people continue practicing their commons?
So actually, I was surprised to learn that in North America and in the early United States, after the U.S. became a country, any unenclosed land was initially considered, is treated as a commons. So if you owned, a lot of Euro-American settlers got these huge land grants, right? They might own 10,000 acres and they might live in a city. They may not even live on these 10,000 acres, but anything that wasn't fenced in was treated by U.S. law as a commons, a place where other people could hunt, gather, graze animals. And what happened is after the Civil War, when enslaved people were emancipated, within a year of the close of the Civil War, every Southern state changed its trespass laws to make hunting, gathering, fishing, all of those subsistence activities on unenclosed land illegal. It took a variety of forms. It wasn't just one law. People did it in different ways in different areas. But this ability of formerly enslaved people to feed themselves on common lands threatened Euro-American planters' economic regime. You know, before emancipation, if an enslaved person was getting part of their food from the commons, well, that was a benefit to a plantation owner, right? They were passing off part of the cost and the work to the enslaved person. And afterwards, as that shifted, there was a very quick move to shut down the commons. And that was really a loss for everyone. And, you know, another kind of little piece of history that we sweep under the rug and don't really talk about.
Sure. Well, having grown up in Montana as a hunter and a fisherman, I'm well aware of the commons that were still available to me as a kid growing up and as a family, as a way of finding meat to eat. So it was still a wonderful thing at that time, getting tighter and tighter and tighter as more and more people show up on the scene. What role did the acorn and nuts play in nutrition for we people? You speak of this great history of the use of nuts. Are they actually really nutritious?
Yeah, they are. They're pretty amazing. So acorns, if you try to eat one just off the ground, you will immediately notice that they're incredibly bitter. I don't know if anyone out there has ever tried to eat an olive off the tree, but my husband did once. His entire face puckered up. And olives have that same bitter compound known as a tannin. And so acorns, just like olives, require processing. They have to be leached. So leaching is repeated soaks in water to remove the tannins because the tannins are water soluble. And then depending on the species of oak, you can make different foods. So we talk about acorns like, oh, an acorn, but actually there are, I think, more than 600 species of oaks, and not all acorns are the same. Some have a lot of oil. So I've actually tasted and visited places where they're making acorn oil. It has this incredible sunset orange color. It's delicious and nutritionally very similar profile to olive oil. Wow. I've also had and made acorn flour. So some acorns are better suited as a starch. And in fact, in addition to flour, just like with potatoes or corn, there's this little fine layer of very pale starch that settles when you're making acorn flour on top of the mixture, because of course you have to run water through the flour at first to leach out those tannins. And Korean cuisine has all these really cool ways of working with acorn starch. There's almost like I don't know what the right term is, acorn jello. Like you use acorn starch and water and salt, and you make this thing called datormuk, which is like this sort of log of acorn jello that gets sliced up and then topped with a really delicious combination of all these finely sliced vegetables, carrots, peppers, lettuces, scallions, and then this like soy, ginger, sesame dressing. So that's one way of using acorn starch, and they make acorn starch noodles, this long list of dishes that I was really fascinated by when I first started researching. And the acorns where I live are best suited to flour. So that's what I've been experimenting with the most. But who knows where you are? It could be oil or starch or something different, but definitely an extremely nutritious food. And there are some not direct studies, but examples of cultures that used to eat acorns as a staple food, and then for various reasons were forced to switch to a more traditional grain-based diet and suffered some pretty severe health consequences. So there's definitely plenty of evidence that acorns are good for us.
Out here on the West Coast in the Monterey Bay, we have an indigenous tribe known as the Ohlone, who were said to live on acorns, and that was their primary source of food. And then, of course, they would supplement that with fish and whatever else they could find. But it was the acorn that provided the foundation for their diet. And then, of course, when the Spanish came with the missions, they were put on farms and, as you said, fed farm food, the grains, which probably did have an adverse effect on their ability when it gets right down to it. It was taken away.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, grains in their whole grain form are obviously quite good for us, but most of the grains we're eating today are refined grains. And so there is a bit of a cautionary tale there, which is that if we grow acorns or other nuts and then just treat them the same way that we've treated grains and refine them and, take out the fats and the nutrients and all that, then that's not a great road to go down. We want foods in their whole form. And right now, nobody is refining acorns. So
right.
they're in their whole form usually when people are eating them.
And so here comes Elspeth Hay with this great notion that maybe if we rejigger how we're doing agriculture and take it back perhaps to a more natural form, that we can actually develop a food chain around acorns and other nuts. And not only that, you're going to take us to a farm where they're doing exactly that, so it's going to be very interesting. So we're going to take a quick break, but here in a couple of minutes. But in your adventuring around the world of nuts, I guess one of the things that really captured me was your description of the Yurok Indians and their use of fire to the people of the fire, and how they used fire to actually cultivate the land so that the trees would bear more nuts, the animals would have grazing land and whatnot. And how did you come upon the Indians of the California's north there?
So the two people who I got to know and spoke with pretty extensively were actually of the Karuk tribe, which is a neighbor. Sure. They're neighbors of the Yurok. But I had found this book. I was searching for anything I could find about people eating acorns. And there's a great book by a non-native sociologist, Carrie Marie Norgard, and it's called Acorns and Salmon Feed Our People. It's pretty dense. It's a sociology book, but I tore through that. And there were a lot of quotes from an indigenous biologist and medicine man named Ron Reed, also a fisherman. And Carrie introduced me to him, and this was at the beginning of the pandemic. So we spent a lot of time talking on Zoom, just talking about acorns and acorn production and oak tending. And Ron, his name's Ron Reed. Ron kept telling me that fire is medicine.
Fire is medicine. I want you to hold that thought.
I didn't really understand that.
Fire is medicine. We're going to take a quick break, ladies and gentlemen, but when we come back, we're going to learn about fire is medicine and the fire people and how they used fire to cultivate the land, which is agriculture. And it's not just modern agriculture that is agriculture. There's all kinds of agriculture, and Elspeth Hay is going to point us in a very interesting direction when we come back from this break. Stay tuned.
You can earn a substantial income by farming for the city. All you need to do is take your crop to market and win the competition for the consumer dollars. There is a well-proven strategy for winning this competition. You will find it embedded in Metro Farm, the guide to growing in or near the city for the city.
Port Ideas, Greg Williams.
There's a tremendous amount of useful information in Metro Farm for farming in or near the city.
Acres USA's Charles Walters.
Metro Farm tells how to convert an opportunity into a real going concern. Every chapter is organized around the logic of practicality. For every problem needing a solution, Metro Farm offers a progression of steps arranged in sequence so the desired goal is achieved.
Before you plant your seeds, pick up a copy of the Ben Franklin Book of the Year award-winning Metro Farm. Then plant your seeds and win the dollars. MetroFarm.com. MetroFarm.com.
We're on the farm with Joel Salatin.
Would you like to buy homemade soup, backyard chicken, and the neighbor's artisanal lunch meat? The Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund protects your right to acquire the food of your choice from the source of your choice. I'm Joel Salatin from Polyface Farm, and I urge you to defend the right of neighbors to engage in direct food commerce. Join today at farmtoconsumer.org, the food of your choice from the source of your choice. That's farmtoconsumer.org. Farmtoconsumer.org. Thank you.
When you buy local American-grown flowers, flowers will grow and flourish in America. Hello, I'm Deborah Prinzing, author of Slow Flowers for certified American-grown flowers. When you buy local flowers, you're helping our country's family farms reduce the transportation footprint of flowers and enjoy fresher, longer-lasting bouquets. So please, next time you shop for flowers, think local. Think certified American-grown flowers. Visit AmericanGrownFlowers.org to learn more.
History buffs. This tale from Michael Olson's Tales from a Tin Can took place aboard the USS Dale during the opening moments 7 December 1941.
As we left our berth and got underway, the deck force was still engaged in getting ready for combat. Fuller had the job of clearing the deck of all the wooden objects that had collected in port, so Fuller was making his way aft, just tossing stuff like a madman, when he came to the ice cream freezer. Before he could toss it over the side, one of the guys said, "Hey, wait a minute!" In a matter of seconds, the lock was broken and the ice cream distributed among the crew. So, what you saw that morning was the USS Dale steaming hell-bent out to the channel while the guys back aft were standing by their guns, eating ice cream and watching World War II break out all around.
Tales from a Tin Can contains 424 tales by 44 sailors aboard the USS Dale, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Order your Father's Day copy at talesfromatincan.com. That's talesfromatincan.com.
So much to say, so little time to say it on the food chain with Michael Olson.
Welcome back. This is the Food Chain Radio program, and we do have so much to talk about and so little time to talk about it with Elspeth Hay, who is the author of the brand new book, Feed Us with Trees, Nuts, and the Future of Food. We, of course, out here in California are very familiar with nut trees. Of course, we're talking about almonds, walnuts maybe. Different kind of agriculture than what Elspeth Hay is presenting us with today. And to tell you how different, she's going to tell us about the indigenous agriculture of Northern California, where the people of the fire use fire as medicine. Take it away, Elspeth.
So before the break, I was just saying how I got to know an indigenous man, Ron Reed, from the Kuruk tribe, and spent a lot of time talking to him about traditional Kuruk acorn production. And the Kuruk people use fire in a variety of ways on the landscape. And Ron told me that, in fact, fire is important for about 75% of Kuruk cultural use species, which I was surprised by and thought was interesting. But I didn't really think it had much to do with my own home landscape of Cape Cod until I learned that, in fact, fire actually is a really important component of most oak ecosystems in North America. So all throughout the Midwest and also in the East, fire has long been used by indigenous people from a variety of nations to tend oak ecosystems and to create the right conditions for oaks to produce more nuts and also hickories. So in the eastern U.S., a lot of oak trees grow in oak hickory forests. Hickories are another nut-producing tree. It's thought, there's some studies indicating that the American chestnut also has some relationship with fire. And in California, these oak ecosystems also involve a lot of hazelnuts, which are another species that's tended with fire. So I was really surprised as I got to know Ron to learn about this really intimate and ancient connection between humans, fire, and these keystone nut trees.
And there you go. And they did use fire, and as did the Plains Indians from where I came from. The Plains Indians were famous for torching the prairie on fire, and in burning off the grasses and the cactus and whatnot, generate new energy for the grass to grow, so the buffalo would have food to eat, the bison, I should say, and the grasses grew remarkably well with these cultivation techniques of the indigenous peoples of the plains. Same is true with those of the forest. So what we think of as primitive was really quite talented and specific. It was a technology there that these people were using.
Fire is a very complex tool. When you look at Euro-American agricultural systems, there's a lot of different tools used, right? There's plows, there's now tractors, there's pesticides, fertilizers, all these inputs. But often in more traditional systems, fire could accomplish a lot of the same jobs. And also there's a lot of talk these days about biochar, right? And how incredibly helpful biochar is for agriculture and for plant production. And when I started learning about this fire history, I knew someone who made biochar. And so I sort of started asking, does biochar get produced in a prescribed fire? And what I learned is yes, depending on the season you're burning, the weather, the plant matter that you're burning, you'll get different amounts of ash versus vapor versus charred matter. But basically what was happening with a lot of those areas that were being treated with cultural burns is that year after year, this black char is building up in the soil on the land. And that is what created the fertility of our Midwestern and other soils that are these black earth. And so it's this older and really more elegant, I think, agricultural system involving these trees and these savannas that created the fertility that today we are mining.
Great. And now I'd like you to take us from that indigenous agriculture to the new farm that you met in the Midwest. Because this seems to be the direction you're taking us, the new farm.
New Forest Farm, which is Mark Shepard's farm in the Midwest, is one of the places that I visited. And he had, I think, 139 edible perennial species planted when I was there. So he had, he wasn't growing as many oaks because, there's not much of a market for acorns yet. But he had chestnuts in the overstory, hazelnuts, apples, pears, asparagus. And what he was basically doing was trying to use the species that are in an oak savanna, in that native ecosystem. And then instead of just using wild plants or unimproved plants, he was using domesticated cultivars. So planting, instead of a native crab apple, a domesticated apple. Planting hybrid hazelnuts that have the productivity of a European filbert, but the disease resistant of an American hazelnut. So really carefully selecting the species that he's working with and the cultivars that he's working with. And he's, far from the only one. I spent some time at a place called Red Fern Farm where they were doing something really similar in Iowa, a place called Badger Set Research Corporation where they were, again, working with woody crops in Minnesota. And I think that this idea is really taking off. There's a nonprofit now called the Savannah Institute in the Midwest, encouraging farmers to adopt these agroforestry systems. And it's exciting. It's exciting to see people remembering how to get back into relationship with these species.
Is that almost like regenerative agriculture?
Well, it is. There's plenty of people arguing over what regenerative agriculture is. And I think that the most convincing definitions that I've heard involve not just, ecological regeneration, but also looking at the social and cultural history that got us to where we are, and are also regenerative in terms of trying to repair those human relationships between cultures.
Metro Farm, about farming small parcels of land in the city, is always met with the objection, you can't grow enough food that way to feed the world. Now, I suspect you're going to run into the same objection with the thought of doing commercial nut production to the extent that you would like to see it happen. What do you say about?
Well, I had that question in my head. Yes, we definitely can. Most people don't know that most of the cropland that we use to produce corn and soy today is either fed to animals that would do better on a savanna or a different diet of grass, or turned into ethanol. So when we say that we need to produce food the way that we do now to feed the world, that is a lie. We're not really using that land to produce food. And additionally, when you look at the yield numbers, it's not producing more food than a polyculture. So monocultures are always inherently less productive than a polyculture. You might see a high yield per acre on a corn farm, for instance, but that yield is artificially inflated by all the land that it's not counting that it took to produce that high yield. So if people are skeptical, I highly recommend they check out the book. I spent years of my life on this question, and I think broke it down in a way that even the biggest skeptic will be convinced that we don't have a yield problem if we want to turn to these nuts.
Well, it certainly surprised me to see your 1943 graph of productivity. So would you be so kind as to describe that in words that people can see in their mind?
Yeah, I think the graph you're talking about, there was a field biologist, I'm forgetting his name, maybe Carl Wolf, who looked at oak yields in the 1940s. So this was about 40 to 50 years, depending on the area, after this, maybe 30 to 40 years after the start of fire suppression. So according to my understanding, yields would already be down somewhat. But even at that time, the yields of oaks per acre was significantly higher than the yields of grains per acre. So at the time when we were supposedly making this switch from these tree-based indigenous systems to the Euro-American grain-based systems because of yield, the grain fields were yielding significantly less than the oak ecosystems. So the grain versus indigenous food production story has been just that all along. It's been a story. If you look at the yield numbers, it's not supported by any of the data.
Do you think this is really possible, Elspeth Hay, to go back in time to restore the savanna, to bring back the oak trees, to develop a food chain based on nuts, as well as having one based on grains? Looking forward, if you could wave a magic wand and change the world to make it a better place, what would you do? We give you a magic wand, Elspeth Hay, author of Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. We give you a magic wand. Wave it. What are you going to do?
I would start by doing some cultural repair between Euro-American settlers and the indigenous people of this place. I don't even know you might need like 3 magic wands for that. But I think that, you know, those human relationships really need to come first. And then I would restore the centuries of ecological knowledge from all of the cultures that are here in the present day United States. And all of us would get back all of this ancestral knowledge that we've lost or become disconnected from. And we would co-create really thriving ecosystems centered on these keystone nut species.
What would you do with the land?
Well, I think that would have to be part of the healing process, but I suspect that we would agree to manage it in a different way, because I don't think our current private property system is really serving most of us. And I suspect most of us would be happier with some common land.
Common land. Commoning.
Yes.
Okay. Elspeth Hay, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a wild ride and a very fun one indeed. Elspeth Hay, the author of the brand new book, Feed Us with Trees, Nuts, and the Future of Food. Thank you so much, Elspeth.
Thank you for having me.
Good luck with your book.
Thank you.
All right. Before we close this show, I would like to tip my hat to guest Elspeth Hay and her book, Feed Us with Trees, Nuts, and the Future of Food. The show, which is Food Chain episode number 1339, began with both Elspeth and I pondering acorns under an oak tree, she in the woods near her home on Cape Cod, and me up the street near my home on the Monterey Bay. What I pondered as I shuffled through the blanket of acorns underfoot was, why is all of this plant nutrition simply going to waste under my feet? What Elspeth pondered was most likely the same question. Though my questioning dissipated as I proceeded out from beneath the oak tree's canopy, Elspeth's questioning did not dissipate at all. In fact, it hardened into a Herman Melville-like quest for the Moby Dick acorn. Elspeth's quest for the acorn took her deep into history, to where it most likely began for all of us on the African savanna, and to the European commons, to the indigenous fire people of Northern California, and to a new attempt at a very old-style agriculture in America's heartland. What Elspeth discovered in her search was that today's industrial agriculture is not the only way to grow food, and that in fact it might not even the best way to grow food. Having read Elspeth's book, I was blessed with the opportunity to make a lot of discoveries with her. The next time I wade through all of those acorns, I will have so much more to think about and enjoy. Who knows? Maybe I will fill up a couple of pockets with acorns, soak them in water, pound them into flour, and then make porridge out of them, just like the Ohlone people did in this neighborhood several hundred years ago. Thank you, Elspeth.
You've been listening to the award-winning Food Chain radio show with Michael Olson. And if your friends missed the show, tell them to log on the Food Chain page at metrofarm.com for a listen. Now, go out and find some food with its farmer's face on it and live.